George Shultz, what are you doing for a living these days?
Oh, I try to live up to my 4 great-grandchildren, who to me represent the future. And I look at them and I say to myself, what can I do to make the world better for these kids?
As a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution, what is it that you do?
Well, I work on the problem of nuclear weapons and how to get better control of them, eventually eliminate them. I work on economic issues. There's a great economics group here. I work on energy subjects. I've been working a great deal on that. And I've also been trying to reflect a little bit on all my experiences and see if there's anything that can be learned from them. And I actually wrote a book to try to do that.
And that book is called Issues on My Mind. Secretary Shultz, what's the main issue on your mind today?
The main issue is that the world that the United States had a great deal to do with constructing after World War II. In effect, we constructed a security and economic commons that served us and served everybody well. That commons is being torn apart right now. And we have to understand what's happening. And we have to be ready to interact in a constructive way to build a more coherent world than the one that's developing. We don't want a chaotic world. So I reflect on my experiences in the book that you held up on the different ways in which we need to go about it. We have some real opportunities in front of us. We have some issues. A lot of the things I propose or talk about are so controversial nobody even wants to hear you talk about them. But anyway, I do, so I enjoy that. That's what I'm doing.
How would you say the world is security-wise today as opposed to when you were Secretary of State in the 1980s?
Very different. In the 1980s, when I was Secretary of State, we had the main threat of the Soviet Union and their nuclear arsenal and our nuclear arsenal, and how you contain that. And maybe you remember from those days, the nuclear cloud was always somewhere there. Well, I think that has diminished a great deal in terms of this Russia-US, although it's still there. But the threat is more of a greater disbursement of nuclear weapons, of the proliferation of them, sometimes in hands that are not deterrable. And in other ways, the world is kind of falling apart. And this is very disturbing, I think.
Rogue states, Iran, potential nuclear power. How should it be handled?
Well, we have said it's not acceptable. I remember, and I use this in my book, when I was a boot in the U.S. Marine Corps. You join the Marines and you think you've joined the Marines. You haven't. You go to boot camp. It's only if you survive boot camp that you become a Marine. And I remember the day the sergeant handed me my rifle. He said, "Take good care of this rifle. This is your best friend. And remember one thing. Never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats." Now, I told that story to President Reagan at one occasion, and he loved it because we said to ourselves, we're going to be very careful what we say, so people will realize that when we say something, it's going to have consequence. It does. And if it's not going to have consequences, we don't say it. So what the administration has in mind, I don't know. But they basically said it's unacceptable for Iran to get nuclear weapons, that the option is not, I think Secretary Kerry testified, it's not containment, the object is prevention. So I don't know what their strategy is for preventing, but it better have some toughness in it or it isn't going to succeed.
Secretary Shultz, what about the superpowers that have nuclear weapons? Russia, U.S. China? Should there be more talks? Should there be less weapons? Should they be dismantled?
One very positive thing has taken place. There have been a lot of positive things, but one more recent was about 3 years ago, I guess. President Obama convened a meeting in Washington. 40 heads of government came. And the object was to see how everybody involved can do a better job of controlling fissile material. Fissile material is what it takes to make a bomb. That's the hard part, getting the fissile material. And then that was followed up with another one 2 years later in Seoul, and I gather there's another one scheduled in Amsterdam. And more heads of government are involved in that, in trying to really get hold of that problem. I think that's a very constructive thing. And in a recent thing that I've written, along with the people I've been working with on this, Henry Kissinger, Sid Drell, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn, we say, let that morph into a kind of a global nuclear enterprise and get all of these, I'll say, more constructive non-rogue states together to keep working at these different kinds of things that need to be done. There's some between us and Russia that need to be done, but there are other things too.
What about when it comes to rogue states? In the 80s, you were part of the administration that strategically bombed Libya. What about bombing Iran, at least its nuclear facilities?
Well, just how you would go about that and how difficult it is, how successful you can be. I'm no part of any intelligence except to see that it's probably difficult. The Israelis are more worried about it than anybody because Iran every other day says they want to eliminate Israel and wipe it out. And if they had a nuclear weapon on the end of a ballistic missile, they could do it. And so I think we've learned from reading Mein Kampf that when somebody like that makes a statement, you should take it seriously and believe them. So I think that we have to think about forceful means, but I'm not in an informed enough position to say more than that.
In Issues on My Mind, you write, when it comes to terrorism, we in this country must think hard about the moral stakes involved. If we truly believe in our democratic values and our way of life, we must be willing to defend them. Passive measures are unlikely to suffice. Means of more active defense and deterrence must be considered and given the necessary political support.
Well, you say, if you have a law enforcement approach, you say, okay, let a terrorist act happen. And then we find out who did it, and we try them in a U.S. court, and if we can make them guilty, and there are endless appeals, they go to jail. Well, what does that accomplish? A certain deterrence, but in the meantime, the terrorist act has taken place. And a terrorist act like 9/11 can kill a lot of people. So if you know something is coming at you, why not stop it from happening? In other words, prevention. And I think when I first said that in 1984, it was very controversial. But after 9/11, people have said, of course, we should be trying to stop that from happening. And so I think this doctrine of trying to prevent things is very important. And it's become common, and we do it a great deal in this country. I think there have been lots of terrorist acts that didn't happen because we found out about them through intelligence and prevented them.
And we're talking with former Secretary of State, former Secretary of Labor, former Secretary of the Treasury, George Shultz, about his new book, Issues on My Mind. Mr. Secretary, what was your favorite job you ever had?
Well, you say job. Job implies something that you have to do in order to get some money. And if you say that, I never had a job in my life. I've always done things that I have found rewarding and interesting. And if I wound up doing something that wasn't like that, I'd find something else to do. But in government, it's a great privilege and opportunity to serve. And I had a succession of jobs. And all of them had their tough moments, but all of them were rewarding, starting with my 2.5 years overseas in the United States Marine